Hello everyone and welcome to this fourth chapter of the Self-Financing Space program. Today I bring you my first mothership in JNSQ. Only 3 chapters since we started uranium mining and we already had enough funds to carry out this project, which will help us fulfill short and long-term contracts, in addition to finally reaching Duna and Eve. I'm actually very happy to have finally reached this point, as it's the first time I've built a ship of this scale in JNSQ. I had already made several quite large ships in stock, but this is definitely another kind of challenge. To get this ship into orbit, my first alternative was to transport it in parts. For that reason you will notice a modular design. However, I could not resist trying a complete launch, which I ended up doing when I realized that it was possible. So, to begin with, I accumulated several tourist contracts and a couple of scientific missions to Mun and Minmus. On this ship, we carry almost all the scientific experiments possible to carry out at this point, in addition to 14 tourists waiting to land in Mun and Minmus. The low TWR of the upper stages forced us to ascend as much as possible with the first stage. For this reason I began the turn at an altitude of approximately 15 kilometers, otherwise we would fall too much in the following minutes to be able to enter orbit. In addition, this would facilitate recovering the first stage as close to the KSP as possible. Using the FRMS mod, it was possible to recover the stage without having to use physics range extender and crossing our fingers. This returned us approximately 1.5 million funds. I must say that despite not having volumetric clouds installed, the view of the sky is still a real delight. So, we recovered this stage without difficulties. Fortunately I put enough parachutes, and now we will continue with the main mission. It certainly took me quite a few attempts to achieve this launch, more than would allow me to call myself an expert, I admit. But well, at least I got a good injection of funds and that feels satisfying. The next thing will be to make landings on the Moon and Minmus with the tourists, although of course, not without first resupplying the ship's fuel tanks, which are at 1/3 of capacity. Then the tourist contract should return us another million, plus a little extra from the scientists' contracts. Once we have finished the job, I will undertake the mission to Duna and Eve. The ship will be able to provide life support for more or less 5 years for the 4 Kerbals, so our main ones will be able to make this round trip without too many difficulties. Even so, I would like to add some additional landing modules to the ship before starting this mission. Regarding the ship, it is completely modular. The engine section can be separated from the habitable module. And the central area is an interchangeable landing pad with the capacity to accommodate 48 passengers plus 3 pilots. It has various deployable science equipment and repair kits in case an engine breaks down. It was one of the parts that was difficult for me to complete because the initial idea was that it be attached at 2 points, the front and the rear, but when I put it into practice the front coupling points forced a twist and did not allow me to enter in an aligned manner between the 2 spaces to anchor, so I had to remove the rear coupling. I tried to avoid redundant parts at all costs, except for docking ports, to minimize the parts count, using only large containers, and as few tanks and engines as possible. I couldn't avoid repeating some components for symmetry and balance reasons. But certainly the number of pieces was quite controlled. Finally, and before beginning resupply, I took the trouble to test the maneuvering capabilities of the lander. This piece will be of utmost importance in the long term, and the last thing I want is to discover that it does not work over Duna's orbit. With everything done, all that remains is to fill the tank. I have to say, it took more creativity than I expected to put a single Kerbodyne fuel depot in Kerbin orbit. All conventional rocket models were barely efficient and absurdly expensive. This design was not necessarily the exception, but at least it allows me to recover all its stages. Who could say? Doing this was so easy in the stock system that I even thought it would be profitable to do this instead of reinforcing the shuttle. But it cost me about 1 million additional funds for this mission, even if I successfully recovered all the stages. Those who wish to play JNSQ take note of this. It is definitely more profitable and easier to launch everything on a single rocket than to carry out several launches with the parts, unless of course you take the time to take each recovered stage to the KSC and extract the fuel instead of buying full tanks in the VAB. Using FRMS, I recovered both stages of the rocket in perfect condition, at least the first, since the second suffered some minor damage during re-entry. Fortunately, the engines, which are the most expensive, did not suffer any damage. I did the rendezvous with the final stage, and we docked to the ship to refill its tanks before leaving for Mun. This was quite tedious because docking a tank of such magnitude, frankly, is a headache, but as always, a ton of patience comes to save the day. By the way, in the meantime, I'd like to take this opportunity to ask you to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and to like this video if you're enjoying this series. That would help my channel a lot, and I would be very grateful. So, I chose to fill the tanks manually to prevent those that were exclusively structural from remaining empty. Once this was done, we were ready to start our first mission. Wish us a good trip and luck, because frankly it was necessary. During the acceleration, the periapsis decayed to 75,000 meters, so the rose with the atmosphere almost destroyed our solar panels. Fortunately, I realized it just in time, so the rest of the trip flowed smoothly. At the same time, we began the journey to Minmus from our Selene research outpost. You won't believe this, but this thing has been in orbit for more than 2 years. It happened to be the last thing I did before suspending my KSP activity, and when I started this series I didn't remember it, so I did all this with that thing in orbit, and I almost launched it again before I realized it was already there. I know what you're thinking. How is it possible that NASA hasn't hired me yet? Amazing. Anyway, fortunately all the position modules were configured with maximum reliability, so no part has suffered damage from disuse. There is only some degradation in the solar panels, but that's all. We can still use it to complete this old contract. It will be necessary to make an adjustment maneuver halfway through the journey, but that will be after completing the trip to Mun with the Nymeria, since it will reach its destination much sooner. Now we are in the Nymeria, heading to Mun. The trip will be considerably longer than in the stock system. The Kerbin moons, contrary to the impression given by the map view, are much further away, so we will have a few additional days of space travel. Halfway through we made a small adjustment to adjust our orbit over Mun above the poles. Although we are transporting tourists, this is still a scientific mission, and we will need to perform several surface scans before abandoning this satellite. Once in Mun, we performed a maneuver to adjust the periapsis to 20,000 meters. Although its shape may suggest otherwise, this ship is not designed to land. I do not rule out modifying it later, but for now, This is the job of the descent module, so, 1 hour after reaching Periapsis, we transfer all the tourists, our pilot, scientific officer, and engineer to the descent module. Only Jebediah will stay on the ship this time, while the rest will be in charge of both transporting the passengers and deploying all the scientific equipment on board the descent module. Sorry Jeb, you were already the first Kerbal in Mun, now it's Valentina's turn. It took me a few minutes to separate the modules since for security, all the docking ports are triple. Therefore it is necessary to undock them all at the same time, or they will start to redock again and again, and it will end up bugged. For this I had to configure a quick action command for the 6 ports. Once done, we separated from the ship without problems. The fire test begins now. Everything depends on at least 90% of things having been done well. We separate from the main ship, and begin the descent to the surface of Mun. We configured a maneuver node only to calculate how much delta V the descent could take, nothing exceptional. After this, we carried out continuous combustion until the surface of Mun. I only turned off the engines once. This is costly in time of use, but beneficial in ignitions. Throttle controller avionic was used to adjust the orientation, and thus save the RCS oxidizer, which would be necessary to dock to the Nymeria later. We did not pack too much, so we had to use it with the greatest possible caution, or we would not have enough for the operation in Minmus. TCA only limits the combustion power, it never turns off the engines, so it will not carry out additional ignitions that could wear out the engine's ignition system. The truth is, I didn't think I was going to get it the first time, but in fact it was. Everything would have been perfect if only I hadn't broken one of the panels with Valentina's head when disembarking, which made me charge game. But for everything else went smoothly. The moonwalk experience with Through the Eyes of a Kerbal is a beauty. Very pleasant just to experience it, so much terrain to explore, it really is the most gigantic open world I have ever seen. For the moment I will leave this video here, otherwise it would become very long, but don't worry, I will continue the next one at the same point where I left this one, and I will try not to miss anything important. For now remember to subscribe and like if you like this series, that helps my channel a lot to continue growing. See you in the next one.